The scream dies in her throat, smothered by the thick, black smoke that blots out the sun. Calloused hands, hardened by a lifetime gripping bows and reins, drag her from the burning wreckage of her home. Just moments ago, she was a 14-year-old merchant's daughter from Kiev, grinding barley for the evening bread, her world defined by the familiar sounds of the marketplace and the protective walls of her city. Now, her father lies dead in the doorway, his blood soaking into the earth, and her world has been reduced to the horsehair rope cutting into her wrists and the harsh, guttural commands of men with eyes like winter storms. Behind her, the only life she has ever known crumbles into ash and memory. She does not know it yet, but she is now a commodity, a single, terrified entry in a ledger of conquest, about to be fed into the most efficient processor of human misery the world has ever seen. This is the year 1240, and the Mongol Empire has arrived. But what was the true engine of their conquest? The chilling mechanism that allowed a nomadic people to build the largest contiguous land empire in history. The answer lies not just in their legendary horsemanship, but in their cold, systematic harvesting of human lives. How did a machine of conquest so vast and so brutal actually function? And why were captured women its most vital component? The Mongols, under the supreme vision of Genghis Khan, understood a fundamental truth that eluded other conquerors. Terror was not merely a byproduct of warfare, it was the most potent weapon in their arsenal. More devastating than any arrow or siege engine was the psychological warfare, the carefully cultivated dread that raced ahead of their armies, paralyzing cities and shattering the will to resist. But this weapon of fear required fuel, and that fuel was human suffering, meticulously calibrated and applied on an industrial scale. While popular culture often romanticizes them as noble warriors on horseback, the reality was far darker. They were military geniuses wrapped in a shroud of industrial-scale brutality. They did not simply conquer territory, they processed it, and the people within it, with the methodical efficiency of a master craftsman. Their approach to captured populations was not one of chaotic plunder, but of systematic evaluation and sorting. The men who could fight or incite rebellion were a threat to be eliminated. The children, especially the boys, were raw material to be molded into future warriors, their original identities scrubbed away and replaced with absolute loyalty to the Great Khan. But the women represented a different kind of resource entirely. They were the cornerstone of this terrifying system, valued as breeding stock, as a labor force, and as sexual property. They were, in the cold calculus of the Mongol war machine, far too valuable to simply waste on the execution grounds. This initial moment of capture, the violent snatching of a young girl from her burning home, was not an isolated act of violence. It was the first step in a continental enterprise of human trafficking, a process designed to grind down individual identity to dust and rebuild the remnants into compliant cogs for the empire. The story of the Mongol Empire is, therefore, also the story of millions of invisible women like her, whose lives and lineages were harvested to fuel an empire built on mountains of bones and rivers of tears. To understand the scale of this operation, one must first look to its architect, Genghis Khan himself. Born Temujin, he emerged from the brutal steppes of Central Asia, a place where survival was a daily battle and mercy was a fatal weakness. He united the fractious Mongol tribes not through charisma alone, but through a combination of brilliant strategic vision and breathtaking, calculated savagery. He instilled in his warriors a discipline unseen in other nomadic armies, but he also codified a new, chillingly pragmatic approach to warfare. The old ways of tribal rivalry involved raids and counter-raids, but Genghis Khan envisioned something far grander and more terrifying, a permanent empire. And for that, he needed a system to manage the human spoils of war. The blueprint for this system was laid down early. In 1202, during his campaign against the rival Tatar tribe, the very tribe responsible for poisoning his own father, his victory was total. But what followed was not a frenzied massacre driven by rage. It was something far colder. Genghis Khan issued a command that would echo through history, a decree that revealed the mechanistic nature of his thinking. Every Tatar male, taller than the linchpin of a cart, was to be executed. This was not arbitrary cruelty. It was policy, refined to mathematical precision. The linchpin measurement, roughly the height of a young boy, was a biological and political threshold. Boys below that height were young enough to be separated from their families, indoctrinated into the Mongol warrior culture, and forged into loyal soldiers for the expanding empire. Their past identities, their Tatar heritage, could be effectively erased. But the older males, those above that line, represented memory, threat, and the potential for future rebellion. They were a security risk that could not be tolerated. They had to die. The women and younger children, however, were assigned a different fate. They were not executed, but distributed among his warriors as slaves and concubines. The women represented reproductive capacity, domestic labor, and a form of biological plunder. This single, brutal order against the Tatars became the foundational template for every Mongol conquest that followed. From the glittering cities of China to the fortified towns of Persia and the wooden fortresses of the Russian principalities, the same pattern would repeat with horrifying consistency. The men would be measured against the linchpin of ideology and utility. The women would be harvested, and somewhere in the chasm between those two fates lay a spectrum of horrors that would redefine human suffering for the conquered peoples of Eurasia. The Mongol war machine was now fully operational, and its most critical function was the processing of human cargo. The fall of a city was not the end of the Mongol war machine's work. It was merely the transition to its most chilling phase. Once the walls were breached and the defenders slaughtered, the celebration did not begin. Instead, a grim, methodical silence would often descend, broken only by barked orders and the weeping of the condemned. The Mongol soldiers, raised from childhood to view outsiders as less than human, would set about their tasks with the dispassionate efficiency of butchers in an abattoir. The entire surviving population, the elderly, the women, the children, would be herded into vast open spaces. The city's main square, a field outside the walls, or the banks of a river. There, under the watchful eyes of mounted archers, the sorting would begin. This was the great winnowing, the process of separating the human chaff from the grain that the empire could use. It was a spectacle of pure, administrative terror, designed to demonstrate that from this moment forward, every single life had a value assigned by the state, and those with no value were simply waste to be disposed of. The elderly and the infirm were the first to be culled. Too frail for the grueling marches ahead, too weak for hard labor, and of no use for breeding, they were a logistical burden. They were often killed on the spot, their bodies tossed into mass graves or burned on pyres that blackened the sky for days. This was not done with rage, but with a cold practicality that was in many ways more horrifying. It was a clear message to the survivors. Your worth is now measured solely by your utility to the Mongol Empire. Next came the children. The boys were pulled from their weeping mothers and lined up. Mongol officers would walk the lines, their eyes assessing not the terror in a child's face, but his physical potential. Was he strong for his age? Did he show spirit? A fire that could be redirected and harnessed. Those who showed promise were taken away to be raised in Mongol camps. They would be taught to ride, to shoot the composite bow, and to live by the yasa, the legal code of Genghis Khan. Their old names, their native languages, and the memory of their mothers would be systematically beaten and drilled out of them, replaced with an unwavering loyalty to the Khan. They were the raw material for the next generation of the Empire's shock troops. The rest, the boys deemed too weak, too sickly, or too young to be easily indoctrinated, would share the fate of their fathers and grandfathers. They were led away to the killing grounds. Their short lives ended for the crime of being a potential future liability. But it was the sorting of the women where the Mongol calculation became most intricate, most clinical, and most devastating. This was where the empire's long-term strategic interests met its immediate, brutal needs. The women were not merely a homogeneous mass of prisoners. They were a resource to be categorized, inventoried, and allocated with precision. They were lined up and inspected with a chilling detachment. Young girls, particularly those who showed signs of beauty, were the most highly prized. Their youth meant more years of reproductive potential and a greater capacity for their identities to be broken and remade. Their terror and innocence were not seen as a tragedy, but as a desirable trait, making them more pliable for their intended roles as concubines and personal servants. Mature women with strong bodies and calloused hands were sorted for manual labor. They would be sent to work in fields, build roads, or maintain the camps, their lives reduced to unending toil. Women who appeared to be of high social status, identified by their finer clothing, their jewelry, or their delicate hands, were also separated. They could be held for ransom, used as diplomatic pawns, or given as prestigious gifts to high-ranking generals. The fate of pregnant women was perhaps the most stark illustration of Mongol pragmatism. They were often subjected to forced abortions or worse, their unborn children cut from their wombs. This was not an act of singular cruelty, but a calculated decision. A pregnant woman was less mobile, required more resources, and the child, if allowed to live, would be a burden and, crucially, would retain a connection to its mother's original identity. The Mongols were thinking generations ahead, and they could not risk a future rebel being nurtured in the womb of a slave. This entire process, this industrial-scale sorting of human beings, was the backbone of the Mongol slave trade. It was a system designed for maximum efficiency and dehumanization. The captives were no longer people with names and histories. They were assets. Scribes would often be present, noting numbers and categories on wax tablets or paper scrolls. These records would then be used to distribute the human plunder according to the complex hierarchy of the Mongol army. The most beautiful and high-status women were reserved for the Khan and his immediate family. Then they would be allocated to generals, then to lower-ranking officers, and finally, the common soldiers would receive their share. Every victory was measured not just in territory conquered, but in the number of women a man could claim. This was the grim reality that followed the dust clouds of the Mongol cavalry, a highly organized, continent-spanning system that turned human lives into the primary currency of conquest. Once the grim sorting was complete, the true journey into oblivion began. The human harvest, now neatly categorized, was mobilized. The Mongols were masters of logistics, and the movement of thousands of captives across thousands of miles was an operation as meticulously planned as a military campaign. The captives, their wrists bound with horsehair rope or linked by long wooden poles, were formed into vast, mournful caravans that trailed behind the army like a bleeding wound. For the young girl from Kiev, ripped from her smoldering city, the world shrank to the dusty back of a wagon or the blistered skin of her feet. The journey itself was a protracted form of torture, a deliberate grinding down process. Food was scarce, clean water even scarcer. The Mongols prioritized their horses and warriors. The human cargo was expected to survive on minimal rations. Those who stumbled from exhaustion or fell ill were not cared for. They were unceremoniously cut from the line and abandoned by the roadside, left to die of exposure or be devoured by scavengers. To slow the convoy was a death sentence, not just for the individual, but for any who might try to help them. The guards, hardened steppe warriors, showed no pity. The wails of children, the sobs of women, the cries for mercy, these were just the background noise of transport, irrelevant to the task of delivery. For many, death on the march became a perverse kind of hope, a release from the unending horror. The survivors soon learned to envy the dead, for they were being transported not to a new life, but to the systematic obliteration of everything they had ever been. The final destination for many of these human caravans was the slave markets that dotted the Mongol trade routes, the most infamous of which thrived in cities like Samarkand and Bukhara. But the ultimate showcase of the empire's human plunder was the capital itself, Karakorum. To approach Karakorum was to witness the terrifying diversity of the Mongol conquest. It was a city built on human suffering, a multicultural nightmare masquerading as a cosmopolitan capital. Visitors from Europe, the Islamic world, and China wrote back with a mixture of awe and horror, describing a city where the sheer variety of slaves on display defied belief. Blonde-haired, fair-skinned Russian girls, their eyes hollow with trauma, worked alongside dark-skinned Arab women captured from the caliphates. Skilled Chinese artisans, now slaves, crafted beautiful objects for their masters, while European peasants from Hungary and Poland tended to animals and mended saddles. It was a grotesque parody of cultural exchange, achieved not through diplomacy or trade, but through the violent uprooting of entire populations. The air in the slave markets was thick with the smell of fear, sweat, and incense, a nauseating cocktail that masked the underlying stench of despair. Mongol overseers and merchants barked out prices, haggling over human flesh with the same dispassionate calculation they used for bolts of silk or bags of spice. Potential buyers, mostly Mongol elites and wealthy merchants from subjugated territories, would inspect the merchandise with cold, appraising eyes. They checked teeth for health, felt muscles for strength, and examined the faces and bodies of young women for beauty. It was the ultimate dehumanization, a public auction where a person's entire worth was reduced to their physical attributes and perceived utility. At the very apex of this system sat the great Khan himself. Genghis Khan's personal household was the ultimate expression of the empire's human collection, a living museum of his conquests. He accumulated wives and concubines like a collector, gathering rare and exotic trophies, each woman representing a defeated people, a sealed alliance, or a humiliated rival kingdom. His principal wives, the Khatuns, often came from powerful Mongol tribes, marriages that solidified political bonds within the steppe confederation. But his secondary wives, the concubines, were the true spoils of war. Princesses and noblewomen who had once commanded respect and authority in their own societies were now reduced to competing for the fleeting attention of the man who had destroyed their world. They lived in elaborately decorated yurts within the royal encampment, their every movement controlled, their existence defined solely by their capacity to please the Khan. This was not about love, or even lust in the simple sense. It was about power, domination, and a chillingly deliberate form of genetic empire building. Genghis Khan famously boasted that his descendants would rule the world, and he used the wombs of his countless wives and concubines as the primary vehicle for this ambition. He was breeding a new imperial aristocracy, a master race whose bloodline would stretch to the farthest corners of the earth. The staggering scale of this project is etched into the very DNA of humanity today. Modern genetic studies have revealed that approximately 1 in every 200 men alive today carries a Y chromosome signature tracing back to a single source in Mongolia from the 13th century, a direct biological legacy of Genghis Khan and his male descendants, written in the wombs of countless conquered women. This is the silent, chilling testimony to the success of the Mongol breeding program, a genetic empire that outlasted the political one, echoing through the centuries as a reminder of the women who were processed, used, and then erased from history. While the Great Khan's household represented the pinnacle of the Mongol slave system, its foundations were built and maintained by the common soldier. For the Mongol warrior, victory was quantified not only in territory seized or treasure looted, but in the number of women he could claim as his personal property. This was not a chaotic free for all of undisciplined troops. It was an institutionalized policy, as structured and systematic as their famed decimal military organization. After a successful campaign, the human plunder was distributed according to a strict hierarchy of rank and merit. The most beautiful, high-status captives were reserved for the Khan, his princes, and his top generals. These women were trophies of the highest order, symbols of supreme conquest. Then, the distribution would trickle down through the ranks. lower-ranking officers, then squad leaders, and finally, the common archers and horsemen. Every man who had fought could expect his share, his tangible reward for loyalty and bravery. This system served a dual purpose. It was both an incentive, a powerful motivator for soldiers to fight fiercely, and a mechanism of control, binding the warriors' prosperity directly to the success of the empire. Scribes accompanied the armies, their ledgers meticulously recording the distribution of human cargo with the same bureaucratic precision applied to sacks of grain or herds of horses. A man's wealth and status were, in part, measured by the number of slaves he owned, and a beautiful captive was a highly valued asset. This institutionalization of sexual slavery was woven so deeply into the fabric of Mongol culture that it became a form of currency, a commodity to be traded and consumed. Warriors gambled women away in games of chance, using them as high-stakes wagers. A man might trade a captive for a better horse, or use her to settle a debt with a comrade. A particularly beautiful or skilled girl might change hands dozens of times in her life, a perpetual object to be bartered and sold, her body a transaction between men. The mortality rate among these women was catastrophic, especially in the initial months following their capture. The combination of physical hardship, relentless sexual violence, psychological trauma, and often deliberate starvation meant that many simply did not survive the brutal transition into slavery. For those who did, their existence was one of utter powerlessness. They were forced to perform hard labor by day, tending animals, setting up and breaking down the mobile yurt camps, processing hides, and cooking, and satisfy their masters' sexual demands by night. Resistance was met with swift and brutal punishment, often death, but more cleverly, sometimes with the torture or murder of a fellow captive the woman had formed a bond with, a tactic designed to shatter the spirit through guilt and fear. The Mongols had turned rape from an act of individual violence into a pillar of state policy, a standardized reward system that fueled the engine of their expansion. Beyond the physical subjugation lay a more insidious and devastating war, the battle for the captive's mind. The Mongols were not mere brutes. They were pragmatic psychologists who understood that a broken spirit was more valuable than a broken body. A woman whose will was crushed would be more compliant, more productive, and less likely to attempt escape or rebellion. To achieve this, they employed techniques of psychological warfare that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. The process of breaking a woman often began before she was even touched by her captor. She was frequently forced to watch the systematic execution of the men of her city, the murder of her children if they were deemed useless, or the brutal torture of her husband or father. This initial trauma was a calculated first blow, designed to sever her from her past and demonstrate the absolute futility of defiance. Once she was numbed by this horror, the process of degradation would begin. She might be stripped naked in front of strangers, her body inspected and discussed like livestock. She would be given a new Mongol name, or more commonly, no name at all, referred to simply by her ethnicity or a physical characteristic, the Russian, the one with dark hair. The scribe's daughter. She was forbidden to speak her native language or practice her religion openly. Any expression of her former identity was punished. The goal was a comprehensive erasure, to scrub away the person she had been and leave a hollow vessel to be filled with a new identity as Mongol property. This systematic dehumanization was the true genius and the true horror of the Mongol machine. It was not enough to own a person's body. The empire sought to conquer and colonize their very soul. The children born from this system of institutionalized rape occupied a strange and painful twilight world, caught between the culture of their conqueror fathers and the shattered heritage of their slave mothers. They were living, breathing monuments to the Mongol victory and their mother's violation. The empire, in its cold pragmatism, found specific uses for these mixed-blood children, but this utility came at a profound psychological cost. These children were neither fully Mongol nor completely foreign. They were often separated from their mothers at a young age, particularly the boys, to prevent what the Mongols saw as the corrupting influence of a broken, subjugated spirit. Boys who showed promise were taken into military training, but they forever bore the stigma of their slave origins. They could rise to become capable warriors or administrators, yet they would never enjoy the same status as a pure-blooded Mongol from the steppes. They were useful precisely because of their divided nature. They could serve as interpreters, as go-betweens with conquered populations, and as garrison troops in territories where their physical resemblance to the local people might offer an advantage. But this very usefulness condemned them to a lifetime of cultural confusion. They were instruments of the empire, yet never fully part of it. They were a biological bridge between two worlds, but could never truly belong to either. For the daughters of slaves, their fate was often a grim echo of their mothers. Their lives were typically destined for domestic or sexual servitude, often within the same household where their mother was enslaved. They grew up witnessing their mother's powerlessness, a constant, living lesson in the consequences of resistance. The trauma of the captive woman was not a single event. It was a legacy, passed down through generations like a poisonous inheritance. A mother, herself brutally broken, would often teach her daughter the behaviors of submission as a necessary strategy for survival. She would instruct her in how to avoid attracting negative attention, how to appear compliant, and how to suppress any spark of the defiance that had been beaten out of her. In this way, the Mongol system achieved its most chilling success. It turned its victims into unwilling accomplices in the perpetuation of their own oppression. The first generation of captives had their identities erased. The second generation was born into a world where that erased identity was the only one they would ever know. The empire had created a self-sustaining cycle of subjugation that required minimal oversight, as the broken spirits of the mothers became the training manual for the daughters. This systematic processing of human beings required a logistical network of staggering scale and complexity. The Mongols applied the same organizational genius that allowed their armies to move with lightning speed to the problem of moving millions of captives across thousands of miles of harsh terrain. This was the birth of a continental network of human misery, connecting the markets of Europe to the households of China. Major trade routes, like the Silk Road, became arteries for the slave trade, with human convoys moving alongside caravans of silk, spices, and porcelain. To manage this flow, the Mongols established a series of way stations and processing centers at key crossroads and in major cities. These were not mere rest stops, they were efficient dehumanization facilities. Upon arrival, new captives would be stripped, bathed, and examined for disease by physicians. Those found to be ill were often killed to prevent the spread of contagion to the rest of the convoy or to the Mongol populace. The healthy were then sorted again, their details recorded in registries. Those deemed suitable for manual labor might be branded with their owner's mark and assigned to work gangs, building infrastructure, or toiling in state-owned workshops. Those selected for sexual or domestic service were cleaned, fed a slightly better diet to improve their appearance, and given rudimentary training in the customs and language of their new masters. The entire system was designed for maximum efficiency and minimum empathy. The weak were culled, the strong were processed, and the survivors were repackaged as Mongol property, their human past systematically obliterated to prepare them for their new life as cogs in the imperial machine. The scale of this operation was unprecedented in human history, a dark mirror to the commercial and cultural exchanges for which the Silk Road is famously known. To understand how ordinary Mongol warriors could participate in such a vast and brutal system of sexual slavery and human processing, one must look at their cultural and psychological conditioning. From childhood, Mongols were raised within a rigid societal framework that explicitly dehumanized outsiders. The term for non-Mongols was often synonymous with foreigner, slave, and even barbarian in their own context. They were taught to view all peoples beyond the steppe not as equals, but as potential subjects or resources, closer to livestock than to fellow human beings. This was not a casual prejudice. It was a systematic indoctrination essential for the empire's function. A warrior who hesitated to rape a captured woman or who showed pity during the slaughter of a city was not seen as compassionate. He was viewed as weak, emotionally compromised, and potentially unreliable. His loyalty to the tribe and the Khan was measured by his willingness to participate fully in the spoils of war, which included sexual violence. This mindset was reinforced by their shamanistic beliefs and the supreme authority of the Yasa, the legal code established by Genghis Khan. The Yasa presented the Mongols as a people destined by the eternal blue heaven to conquer the world. All who resisted were, by definition, in defiance of divine will, and thus deserved any fate that befell them. This ideological framework provided a moral justification for atrocities, transforming acts of extreme cruelty into duties performed in service to a higher power and the Great Khan. This dehumanizing ideology was then codified into a sophisticated legal framework that managed human property with chilling precision. Mongol law recognized various categories of slaves, each with specific rules governing their treatment, value, and inheritance. High-ranking captives, such as skilled artisans, learned scholars, or beautiful noblewomen destined for the Khan's court, existed in a privileged category. They might retain some vestiges of their former status, living in relative comfort while performing administrative, diplomatic, or artistic functions. Their value was high, and they were treated with a degree of care, much like a master craftsman would care for a fine tool. The middle tier consisted of domestic servants, common laborers, and concubines for mid-level officers. Their lives were ones of hard work and sexual servitude, but they were still valuable assets. The lowest category, which included the vast majority of captured women, were classified alongside livestock. They were subject to the same laws that governed horses, sheep, or cattle. They could be bought, sold, traded, gifted, or willed to heirs. Punishment for disobedience was severe and often fatal, but it was treated as the disposal of damaged property, not a moral transgression. This legalistic approach to human bondage was a hallmark of the Mongol system. It wasn't primitive barbarism. It was a cold, calculating jurisprudence applied to the mass exploitation of human beings. A vast bureaucracy, with scribes and administrators, tracked this human cargo using detailed registries, bills of sale, and transfer documents. The empire knew, with bureaucratic certainty, how many human assets it possessed and where they were allocated. The long-term strategic thinking of the Mongols extended beyond immediate labor and gratification into deliberate, state-sponsored breeding programs. This was the culmination of their genetic empire building. The system was hierarchical and ruthlessly efficient. The most beautiful, intelligent, and high-status captured women were reserved for breeding with the Mongol elite, the Khan, his princes, and his top generals. The goal was to produce a ruling class that combined the perceived warrior superiority of the Mongols with the refined administrative skills and cultural knowledge of conquered civilizations. These children were destined for governorships, military commands, and key administrative posts across the empire. They were the hybrid administrators who could effectively rule over populations they physically resembled while maintaining absolute loyalty to the Mongol core. For the common soldiers, the breeding program served a different purpose. Less attractive or lower status captives were paired with rank-and-file warriors to produce the next generation of soldiers and workers. These children would be raised in Mongol camps, indoctrinated from birth, and would swell the ranks of the army, ensuring a steady supply of manpower for future campaigns. The Mongols were, in effect, practicing a form of large-scale, strategic eugenics centuries before the term was coined. They understood that conquest could be biological as well as military. By flooding their conquered territories with a new generation of mixed-blood children loyal only to the empire, they were securing their dominion for generations to come. This program explains the staggering genetic legacy left by the Mongols, a legacy not merely of Genghis Khan himself, but of his entire warrior class. It was a cold, calculated policy that viewed women not as people, but as vessels for a genetic and imperial project, their wombs as battlefields in a war for permanent control. The Mongol war machine first rolled into Eastern Europe in 1241, and the shock of its arrival introduced Western societies to a form of warfare and human trafficking they could scarcely comprehend. The invasions of Poland and Hungary were not merely military defeats. They were an existential catastrophe that revealed a new, industrial scale of cruelty. As the Mongol tumens, or armies of 10,000, swept through regions like Silesia and Transylvania, they did not just defeat armies, they systematically harvested the population. Contemporary European chronicles, written by monks and scribes who witnessed the aftermath, describe a terror so absolute it defied language. They wrote of towns where not a single soul was left alive, of forests filled with refugees who froze to death or starved, and of pyramids of human skulls erected by the Mongols as grim monuments to their efficiency. The psychological impact was profound and lasting. The threat of capture and enslavement became a weapon that paralyzed resistance before the Mongol vanguard even appeared. Rumors of their approach could cause entire communities to abandon their homes and flee into the wilderness, creating the first great refugee crisis in medieval European history. In some cases, the dread was so overwhelming that communities chose mass suicide over the prospect of falling into Mongol hands. These were not the chivalric conflicts Europeans were accustomed to. This was a force that operated on a different moral and strategic plane, one where the systematic processing of human beings was a primary objective. The Mongol advance into Europe also showcased their mastery of psychological warfare. The stories of their atrocities, carried by fleeing survivors, raced ahead of their armies, acting as a force multiplier. A city hearing of the fate of its neighbor, the men slaughtered, the women bound and led away into slavery, was often crippled by fear. Defenders would be demoralized before the first arrow was loosed. This carefully cultivated reputation for terror was a deliberate tactic. By ensuring that tales of their ruthlessness spread, the Mongols could often secure surrender without a fight, saving their own resources and acquiring intact cities and populations. When a city did surrender, the outcome was unpredictable, which made the terror even more effective. Sometimes they were spared and absorbed into the empire's tax base. Other times, they were still enslaved, a stark lesson that surrender was no guarantee of safety. This unpredictability kept all conquered peoples in a state of perpetual anxiety and submission. The Mongols had weaponized fear itself, and in Europe, they found a population utterly unprepared for this form of total war. The trauma embedded itself deep into the cultural memory of Eastern Europe, shaping folklore, art, and the region's historical wariness of invaders from the East for centuries to come. Beyond the physical conquest and the psychological terror lay the Mongols' ultimate ambition, not just to rule over foreign peoples, but to absorb and digest them, transforming them into extensions of the Mongol organism. Captured women were the crucial, unwilling bridges in this process of cultural annihilation. The empire's vast intelligence apparatus relied heavily on these broken women who had been processed, trained, and forced to collaborate. Having been stripped of their own identities, they became experts at identifying the social hierarchies and hidden vulnerabilities of newly conquered territories. They could spot a nobleman trying to disguise himself as a peasant, recognize the speech patterns of a wealthy merchant's daughter, or identify a woman with skills in medicine, weaving, or literacy. Their knowledge, extracted under extreme duress, became the oil that kept the Mongol administrative machine running smoothly. These women, for that is what they were, however unwillingly, became collaborators. Their betrayals, whether identifying a hidden leader or translating the desperate whispers of new prisoners, were essential for the Mongols to quickly understand and control the societies they had just shattered. This was the final, cruel twist of the system. It turned the victims into instruments of their own people's subjugation. The process of converting a captive into a compliant component of the empire was methodical and reflected a deep, if brutal, understanding of human psychology. New captives were immediately isolated from anyone who shared their language, religion, or customs. This prevented the formation of resistance networks and the comfort of shared grief. In this state of profound isolation and disorientation, they were assigned new Mongol names, new menial roles, and new identities that had no connection to their past lives. The system then employed a calculated strategy of alternating cruelty and reward, a technique that modern psychologists would recognize as a method for creating traumatic bonding. A woman might be savagely beaten for a minor infraction one day, and then given a piece of fruit or a warmer blanket the next for a trivial compliance. This unpredictability destroyed her sense of agency and made her grateful for the slightest hint of kindness from her captors. She would begin to modify her behavior, not out of reasoned choice, but out of a desperate, conditioned response to avoid pain and seek unpredictable rewards. Those who adapted quickly were given better food or less arduous duties. Those who resisted were made public examples, their punishments designed to educate the others about the utter futility of defiance. Through this systematic application of isolation, identity destruction, and behavioral conditioning, the Mongols pioneered a form of psychological manipulation that effectively rewired human beings for servitude, ensuring their broken spirits would serve the empire as reliably as their broken bodies. The religious policies of the Mongol Empire, often praised by historians as remarkably tolerant, served a far more sinister purpose within the context of their slave system. This tolerance was not an expression of enlightenment. It was a sophisticated tool of control, meticulously designed to manage the spiritual lives of millions of captives in a way that reinforced their subjugation. Unlike in contemporary Europe or the Islamic world, where conversion by the sword was common, the Mongols had no interest in imposing their native shamanistic beliefs. Instead, they permitted Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and others to practice their faiths, but only under strict supervision and in a deliberately corrupted form. A Christian woman could pray, but she might be forced to pray for the health and success of the great Khan, the very man who had destroyed her world. A Muslim woman might be allowed to observe Ramadan, but only if she continued to fulfill all her duties as a slave, including sexual servitude, breaking the very fast that was central to the holy month. This created a spiritual crisis that was itself a form of bondage. Faith, which should have been a source of solace and strength, became twisted into another chain. By allowing a hollowed-out version of their religion, the Mongols prevented it from becoming a rallying point for resistance, while simultaneously demonstrating their absolute power over every aspect of a captive's life, even their connection to the divine. This systematic approach to conquest and slavery created a continental network of human misery that fundamentally reshaped the demographics of Eurasia. The scale of the Mongol slave trade was unprecedented, dwarfing anything that had come before. Conservative estimates suggest that millions of people were enslaved during the century of peak Mongol expansion, with women and children constituting the vast majority of this human cargo. The empire functioned as history's first truly international human trafficking network, connecting slave markets from the edges of Europe to the coasts of China. A Slavic woman from Kiev could end her days as a domestic servant in a household in Karakorum. A Persian girl skilled in weaving could be forced to work in a state-run workshop in northern China. The Mongols had created a grim parody of globalization, where the most traded commodity was human suffering. The logistics of moving this many people across such vast distances required immense organizational skill. The same network of horse relay stations, the YAM, that allowed for the rapid movement of messengers and officials, also facilitated the transit of slave caravans. Rest stops became processing centers, and major market cities like Sarai on the Volga River grew into massive, permanent hubs for the slave trade, an institution that would outlive the empire itself by centuries. The collapse of the unified Mongol Empire in the late 13th and 14th centuries did not bring freedom to the millions of enslaved women and their descendants. Instead, the vast human processing system simply fragmented the successor states the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, each inherited and maintained their own versions of the Mongol slave apparatus. The machinery of oppression had become so deeply entrenched in the economies and social structures of Eurasia that it outlived the political entity that created it. The Golden Horde continued to raid for slaves in Eastern Europe for generations, funneling them to markets in the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Mamluks of Egypt, themselves a slave soldier dynasty, were supplied through this very network. In China, the Yuan dynasty maintained a vast population of foreign concubines and servants, a living reminder of Mongol dominance. The techniques of psychological manipulation, the bureaucratic tracking of human property, and the strategic use of sexual slavery were adopted and adapted by these successor khanates. The fall of the Central Empire did not end the suffering, it merely decentralized it, scattering the legacy of Genghis Khan's system across a dozen different kingdoms and ensuring that the practice of large-scale, systematic human trafficking would remain a feature of Eurasian life for centuries to come. The most enduring and visible legacy of this system, however, is written in the very bloodlines of humanity. Modern genetic science has provided irrefutable evidence of the scale of Mongol sexual exploitation in a way that chroniclers' accounts never could. Population geneticists studying the Y chromosome, passed virtually unchanged from father to son, have identified a lineage that spread with astonishing rapidity from the Pacific coast of Asia to the shores of the Caspian Sea in just a few generations. This lineage, originating in Mongolia around the time of Genghis Khan, is so widespread that an estimated 1 inch every 200 men alive today is a direct descendant of this Mongol patriarch. But this is only half the story. The mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively from mother to child, tells the quieter, yet equally vast, story of the victims. Studies of populations across Central Asia and Eastern Europe reveal distinct maternal lineages that can be traced to distant regions, providing a genetic map of the forced migrations of women. These are the molecular echoes of the merchant's daughter from Kiev, the princess from Baghdad, and the countless anonymous women who were taken, whose wombs became the vehicles for the empire's genetic expansion. This biological evidence confirms the horrifying success of the Mongol breeding programs, creating a living archive of conquest that persists in our very cells, a silent testimony to the millions of women whose lives and lineages were harvested to build an empire. The psychological devastation inflicted by the Mongol system was not confined to the individual. It was a trauma that seeped into the very bedrock of conquered societies, altering their cultural DNA for generations. The knowledge that such systematic dehumanization was possible, that human beings could be processed like livestock and their identities systematically erased, introduced a profound existential fear into the collective consciousness. This was not the typical fear of war or famine, but a deeper terror about the fragility of civilization itself. Folktales and epic poems from Russia to Persia are filled with stories of the Mongol scourge, often depicting them not as men, but as monstrous, inhuman forces from the steppes. These stories served as cautionary tales, embedding the trauma of mass rape, enslavement, and cultural destruction into the oral and written traditions of entire peoples. The experience taught a brutal lesson that all the achievements of culture, art, religion, law, family could be obliterated in an instant by a sufficiently ruthless and organized power. This legacy of vulnerability shaped the foreign policy of nations like Russia for centuries, fostering a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders and a centralized, often autocratic, state apparatus designed specifically to withstand such an existential threat ever again. The Mongol invasions were a searing brand on the psyche of Eurasia, a wound that shaped identities and political structures long after the empire had crumbled into dust. When compared to other historical slave-holding societies, the unique and terrifying efficiency of the Mongol system becomes starkly apparent. The Vikings, for instance, were prolific slave takers, but their operations were decentralized, conducted by individual chieftains on a relatively small scale. There was no overarching bureaucratic system, no continental breeding program, no unified policy of using slavery as a primary tool of statecraft. The Romans built an economy deeply dependent on slave labor, and their conquests certainly involved mass enslavement. However, the Roman approach was primarily economic. Slaves were a labor force to build monuments, work latifundia, and serve in households. The Mongol use of slavery was far more comprehensive and strategic. For them, slaves were not just labor, they were a resource for genetic expansion, a tool for psychological warfare, a reward system for their military, and a means of permanently altering the demographic and cultural landscape of conquered territories. The Romans sought to exploit the bodies of the conquered. The Mongols sought to possess and reshape their very essence, erasing the past and engineering the future. This strategic depth and systematic organization are what set the Mongol slave apparatus apart, making it a precursor to the mass social engineering projects of modern totalitarian states. The administrative records left behind by the Mongols and their successor states provide a chillingly dispassionate paper trail of this vast human suffering. These are not the emotional chronicles of victims, but the dry, bureaucratic documents of the victors. Registers of slave distributions read like livestock inventories. To Officer Batur, 5 healthy females, ages 14 to 20, for domestic service. Inventories catalogue human beings by age, physical characteristics, skills, and estimated value. Transfer documents meticulously track the movement of women and children across thousands of miles, noting deaths, births, and changes in ownership with a clerk's detached precision. A single line in a ledger. 1 female, Georgian, deceased en route. Dysentery represents a universe of extinguished hope and suffering. These records reveal that the Mongol system was not the chaotic product of a barbarian horde, but the methodical, well-documented operation of history's most efficient slave trading enterprise. The sheer volume and coldness of these documents stand as a testament to the scale of the operation and the complete dehumanization that was its core principle. They are the undeniable evidence that the processing of people was a central, administrative function of the empire, as routine and essential as collecting taxes or raising armies. Perhaps the most disturbing question that arises from studying this period is not how the Mongols could commit such acts, but how thoroughly their system succeeded in its ultimate goal of breaking the human spirit. Unlike other conquerors who faced perpetual rebellion, the Mongols, for the duration of their unified rule, maintained a staggering level of control over a vast and diverse population. They achieved this because their methods went beyond physical terror. They created a self-perpetuating cycle of oppression, where victims were transformed into instruments of their own subjugation. A captured woman, once broken, would often enforce the rules upon newer captives. A child born of rape, caught between 2 worlds, would frequently pledge absolute loyalty to the Mongol state as his only path to a semblance of status. The empire systematically dismantled the very building blocks of identity, family, faith, language, and community, and then offered a grim, utilitarian purpose in their place. Survival itself became contingent on accepting this new, hollowed-out existence. This demonstrated a chilling truth about human nature, that the will to survive can, under extreme and systematic pressure, be harnessed to serve the very power that seeks to destroy it. The Mongols proved that with sufficient ruthlessness and organizational skill, resistance could not just be crushed, but could be reprogrammed into compliance. This success is the darkest part of their legacy, a sobering lesson in the potential depths of human subjugation and the terrifying efficiency of a system designed to eradicate not just lives, but the very desire for freedom. The techniques of mass control and psychological manipulation perfected by the Mongols did not vanish with their empire. Instead, they became a dark inheritance, a playbook for human cruelty that would be studied, refined, and re-implemented by later regimes seeking absolute power. The systematic dehumanization, the industrial-scale processing of human beings, the use of terror as an administrative tool, these were innovations in statecraft as significant as any military technology. Centuries later, echoes of the Mongol system can be seen in Stalin's Great Purge and the forced deportations of entire ethnic groups to Siberia. The Soviet Gulag system, with its bureaucratic efficiency in managing millions of prisoners, its brutal transportation in cattle cars, and its goal of breaking individuals through a combination of hard labor and psychological pressure, mirrors the Mongol slave logistics and processing centers. The Nazis' concentration camps took this a step further, incorporating the Mongol concept of sorting populations upon arrival, but with the chilling addition of industrial technology to carry out extermination on a scale the Mongols could not have imagined. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, with their forced evacuations of cities and their systematic erasure of individual identity, family, and culture, repeated the same fundamental process of breaking down the human spirit to rebuild it in service to a totalitarian ideal. The Mongol Empire had demonstrated, for the first time on a continental scale, that human beings could be processed as a resource, and this lesson was tragically learned by the worst dictatorships of the modern era. What makes the Mongol system particularly chilling from a modern perspective is how its economic and cultural achievements were inextricably linked to its atrocities. The famed Pax Mongolica, the period of stability across the Silk Road that facilitated unprecedented trade and cultural exchange between East and West, was built upon a foundation of mass slavery and terror. The same trade routes that carried silk, spices, and ideas also carried endless lines of shackled human beings. The administrative systems that allowed for efficient governance across diverse cultures were developed to manage the extraction of resources, including human resources. The multiculturalism of cities like Karakoram was a direct result of violent conquest and forced relocation. To celebrate the Mongol Empire's role in connecting the world without acknowledging that this connection was forged in blood and sustained by human misery is to tell only half the story. The empire functioned as a single, integrated system, where the flow of commerce and the flow of slaves were two sides of the same coin. The prosperity and connectivity it brought to some were funded by the utter destruction of countless others. This uncomfortable truth forces us to confront the complex moral calculus of history, where great historical shifts are often propelled by engines of profound suffering. The voices of the women who endured this system are largely absent from the historical record. Most were illiterate, and their stories died with them. But their testimony is not entirely lost. It is encoded in other forms. It echoes in the lament songs and tragic folk tales of the peoples of Eurasia, where themes of sudden abduction and lost homeland are hauntingly common. It is whispered in the patterns of mitochondrial DNA, a genetic memory of the immense journeys they were forced to undertake. It is implied in the cold, bureaucratic language of the Mongol slave registries, where each entry is a silent scream. It is etched into the archaeological record, in the mass graves that border ancient trade routes, and in the ruins of cities that were never rebuilt. These scattered traces form a collective, unspoken testimony that no amount of historical romanticism can fully silence. Piecing together this story from its fragments is an act of historical recovery, an attempt to grant a voice to the millions who were systematically silenced, and to acknowledge that their suffering is an inseparable part of the world we live in today. Ultimately, the story of the Mongol Empire and its system of sexual slavery forces us to grapple with a deeply unsettling question about the nature of power and historical legacy. Were the Mongols visionary leaders who created the first global economy and connected civilizations? Or were they the masterminds of history's most successful human trafficking network, whose innovations in cruelty inspired generations of monsters? The evidence compels us to conclude that they were both. Their military genius, their administrative prowess, and their role in shaping the modern world cannot be divorced from the industrial-scale brutality that made it all possible. They built their empire on mountains of bones and rivers of tears, and they did so with a clear-eyed, pragmatic ruthlessness that they themselves would have seen not as evil, but as the natural order of the world. The strong devour the weak. The clever exploit the naive. Mercy is a luxury that conquerors cannot afford. 8 centuries later, the choice of how to judge them rests with us. We are left with the overwhelming evidence, the silent testimony of the victims, and the enduring consequences that still shape our world. The Mongols achieved exactly what they set out to do. They broke the bodies and spirits of millions. They harvested their lives and their lineages, and they built an empire that forever changed the course of history. The uncomfortable truth they leave us with is that such terrible efficiency can be terrifyingly successful. The sheer continental scale of the Mongol slave trade remains almost incomprehensible, dwarfing all previous and many subsequent systems of human bondage in its geographical reach and bureaucratic efficiency. Conservative estimates, pieced together from chronicles, tax records, and the accounts of observers like Marco Polo, suggest that millions of people were enslaved during the century of peak Mongol expansion. To put this in perspective, the entire population of Europe at the time is estimated to have been around 70 million. The Mongol machine consumed a significant percentage of the human beings it encountered, processing them across a network that spanned 13 time zones. This was not a series of isolated raids. It was a continuous, coordinated enterprise that connected the slave markets of the Crimea to the households of Beijing, creating the first truly globalized economy of suffering. A girl captured in the Hungarian plains could find herself serving in a Persian workshop, while a Chinese artisan could be forced to build siege engines for an assault on a Russian city. This systematic redistribution of human capital was as integral to the empire's function as its famed Pony Express messenger system. The Mongols understood that to control a territory, they had to control its people, and the most effective form of control was to uproot them, sever their ties to the land and culture, and repurpose them as anonymous, interchangeable units of labor and reproduction in a vast imperial project. This system also pioneered new, insidious forms of sexual exploitation that were specifically designed for long-term, strategic benefit. The Mongols did not merely engage in the brutal, impulsive rape that has tragically accompanied warfare throughout history. They elevated it to a calculated policy of biological warfare. The systematic impregnation of captured women was a deliberate strategy to flood conquered territories with a generation of mixed-blood children. These children, raised in or near Mongol camps and indoctrinated with Mongol values, would grow up culturally aligned with the empire, yet physically resembling the local population. This made them perfect agents of control administrators, tax collectors, and interpreters who could govern subjugated peoples with an insider's knowledge but an outsider's loyalty. They were the human shock absorbers of the empire, mitigating the friction between conqueror and conquered. This program was so effective that it created a lasting social class across Central Asia, a stratum of people who were neither fully Mongol nor fully native, but who owed their position and identity solely to the empire that had engineered their birth. This was sexual slavery weaponized to its fullest extent, transforming the act of rape from a tool of terror into a tool of long-term demographic and political engineering. The sophistication of the Mongol system becomes starkly clear when compared to other historical examples. The Vikings, often portrayed as the great slavers of the early medieval period, operated on a much smaller, less organized scale. Their raids were conducted by independent chieftains for personal gain, with no overarching strategy for integrating slaves into a larger imperial framework. Slaves, or thralls, were primarily status symbols and domestic laborers. The Romans, of course, practiced slavery on a massive scale, and their economy was deeply dependent on it. However, the Roman model was fundamentally economic. The goal was to acquire labor to build aqueducts, work plantations, and serve in households. The Mongol model was far more holistic and strategic. For For the Romans, a slave was a unit of labor. For the Mongols, a slave, particularly a female one, was a multi-purpose asset, a laborer, a sexual companion, a reproductive vessel, and a psychological weapon. The Mongols integrated slavery into every facet of their statecraft, military, economic, demographic, and psychological, in a way the Romans never did. This comprehensive approach is what made the Mongol system uniquely terrifying and effective, a blueprint for totalitarian control that would not be seen again until the 20th century. The collapse of the unified Mongol Empire in the 14th century did not dismantle the slave trading infrastructure it had created. Instead, the system fragmented and was inherited by its successor states, each of which continued and often refined the practice. The Golden Horde, which ruled over Russia and the Pontic-Caspian steppe, turned slave raiding into a cornerstone of its economy for centuries. Their periodic raids into Poland, Lithuania, and the Russian principalities provided a steady stream of human cargo for markets in the Crimea, which in turn supplied the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and the rising Ottoman Empire. The Crimean slave markets, run by the Khanate of Crimea, became a major hub of the European and Mediterranean slave trade until the late 18th century, a direct continuation of the Mongol system. Similarly, the Timurids, who saw themselves as heirs to the Mongols, maintained vast harems and slave armies. The Ottomans later perfected the Devshirme system, conscripting boys from conquered Christian lands, which, while different in its specifics, was rooted in the same Mongol logic of harvesting human resources from subjugated populations. The techniques of mass abduction, long-distance transport, and bureaucratic management of human property outlived the empire that pioneered them, proving to be one of its most durable and tragic exports. The Mongol Empire fell, but its innovations in human trafficking became a permanent and horrific feature of the Eurasian landscape for generations. The psychological techniques employed by the Mongols to dismantle individual identity and rebuild a captive into a compliant slave were remarkably sophisticated, prefiguring modern understandings of coercive control and brainwashing. The process was methodical, moving beyond physical domination to attack the very core of a person's being. The first and most crucial step was isolation. A new captive was immediately severed from anyone who shared her language, culture, or history. This strategic isolation prevented the formation of supportive bonds and created a state of profound disorientation and dependency. In this vulnerable state, she was utterly reliant on her captors for her most basic needs: food, water, and even the meaning of the commands barked at her. This dependency was the fertile ground in which the seeds of a new, subservient identity could be planted. The systematic erasure of her past then began in earnest. Her name, the most fundamental marker of self, was taken away. She was forbidden to speak her native tongue or practice her faith in any meaningful way. Any expression of her former culture was punished, often brutally. This was a deliberate assault on memory and heritage, a forced amnesia designed to create a hollow vessel. Into this psychological void, the Mongols then introduced a relentless and unpredictable system of punishment and reward, a mechanism designed to break the will and reshape behavior. This was not mere random brutality. It was a calculated alternation of extreme cruelty and small, unexpected kindnesses. A woman might be savagely beaten for a minor infraction one day, and then given a piece of fruit or a warmer blanket the next for a trivial act of compliance. This unpredictability was psychologically devastating. It destroyed her ability to predict consequences, creating a constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance. More insidiously, it fostered a twisted sense of gratitude towards her captors for any respite from the terror. She began to seek their approval not out of reasoned choice, but from a conditioned, desperate reflex to avoid pain and secure unpredictable rewards. This technique, known today as traumatic bonding, creates powerful emotional attachments to abusers and is a cornerstone of modern coercive control. Those who adapted quickly to this new reality, showing subservience, learning a few words of Mongol, performing their duties without complaint, were rewarded with slightly better food, less arduous work, or a semblance of security. Those who resisted were made public examples, their punishments serving as a grim lesson to others on the absolute futility of defiance. Through this systematic application of isolation, identity destruction, and behavioral conditioning, the Mongols effectively rewired human beings for servitude. The empire's much-lauded religious tolerance was, in practice, another finely tuned instrument of control within this system of psychological manipulation. Unlike in medieval Europe or the Islamic world, where religious conformity was often enforced, the Mongols permitted a wide range of faiths. However, this was not enlightened pluralism. It was a pragmatic strategy to manage spiritual life in a way that prevented organized resistance and reinforced the captive's subjugation. A Christian woman might be allowed to pray, but she would be forced to pray for the health and longevity of the great Khan. A Muslim woman might be permitted to observe Ramadan, but only if she continued her duties as a sexual servant, thus profaning the very fast she was undertaking. This created a profound spiritual conflict, corrupting the captive's most deeply held beliefs and turning her faith from a source of solace and strength into a source of shame and cognitive dissonance. Her religion was permitted to exist only in a hollowed-out, state-sanctioned form that ultimately served her masters. This tolerance demonstrated the Mongols' absolute power over every facet of a person's life, including their connection to the divine. It was a masterstroke of psychological control, ensuring that even the inner world of faith was colonized and made to serve the empire. The legacy of this systematic psychological destruction extended far beyond the individual, creating intergenerational trauma that shaped the cultures of conquered peoples for centuries. Children born into this system, particularly those of mixed parentage, inherited a world of confusion and fractured identity. They were often separated from their slave mothers, or grew up witnessing their profound powerlessness. They were taught that their value came from their connection to their Mongol father, yet they were perpetually marked as half-breeds, never fully accepted. The trauma of the mothers, the shame, the fear, the learned helplessness was unconsciously passed down, shaping parenting styles and worldviews. Folk tales and laments from Russia to the Caucasus are filled with themes of sudden, violent loss, of beautiful daughters stolen away never to return, of a deep-seated fatalism in the face of overwhelming power. This cultural memory, born from the Mongol experience, fostered a pervasive sense of vulnerability and a centralized, often autocratic, political culture designed to withstand such existential threats in the future. The Mongols did not just break individuals, they broke the social and psychological fabric of entire civilizations, and the scars of that breaking, woven into language, story, and collective memory, became a part of their enduring, tragic legacy. The administrative machinery that managed the Mongol Empire's vast human plunder was a triumph of bureaucratic organization applied to a horrific purpose. This was not the chaotic looting of a rampaging horde, but a disciplined, state-run enterprise with its own complex legal and economic rules. At the heart of this system were the scribes and officials who meticulously documented every aspect of the slave trade. Their records, some of which have survived in archives from Russia to China, provide a chillingly dispassionate view of this human tragedy. They kept detailed registries that catalogued human beings with the same precision as livestock or bundles of silk. An entry might read, Item: 37 female captives from the Sarai convoy, ages ranging from 12 to 30 winters, 10 assigned to the household of General Subutai, 5 to the central kitchens, 22 to the slave market for disbursement to junior officers. These were not just lists, they were legal and financial documents. Bills of sale for slaves were common, and they often included clauses about the item's health and skills. Transfer documents tracked the movement of human property across vast distances, noting changes in ownership with bureaucratic detachment. the death of a slave was recorded not as a tragedy, but as a loss of assets, often with a simple notation like deceased en route, cause, fever. This bureaucracy was essential for the distribution of human plunder, which was a carefully managed process tied directly to military rank and merit. Following a campaign, the booty, including slaves, was collected at a central point. Officials would then oversee its division according to a strict hierarchy. The Khan and the imperial family received the choicest portion, which included the most beautiful women, skilled artisans, and high-status individuals who could be used for diplomacy or ransom. Then, the distribution cascaded down through the ranks. Generals, then lower-ranking officers, and finally, the common soldiers. This system was a powerful tool for maintaining loyalty and morale. A warrior's prosperity was directly linked to the success of the empire. The more victories he fought in, the greater his share of the human and material spoils. This institutionalized the entire process, transforming sexual slavery and human ownership from a potential crime into a rewarded duty. The meticulous records ensured that every warrior received his fair share according to his station, preventing internal disputes and reinforcing the military discipline for which the Mongols were famous. The empire had turned the brutal business of slavery into a smoothly functioning administrative routine. The legal framework, the yasa, codified by Genghis Khan, provided the foundation for this system, giving it a veneer of legitimacy and order. The yasa explicitly defined the status of slaves and the rights of their owners. It created different categories of human property. At the top were high-value captives, like princes, skilled craftsmen, or beautiful noblewomen. They might live in relative comfort and retain some semblance of their former status, but they were still property. The vast majority of enslaved women fell into the category of common slaves, who were legally classified alongside livestock. The laws governing the theft or injury of a horse often applied similarly to a slave. A master had the legal right to punish his slaves as he saw fit, including with death, though the yasa did sometimes punish the wanton destruction of another man's property, as it represented a loss to the collective wealth of the tribe or empire. This legalistic approach is what separates the Mongol system from mere savagery. It was a cold, calculating jurisprudence that normalized the ownership and exploitation of human beings, integrating it fully into the economic and social fabric of the empire. It was barbarism, systematized and administered with brilliant efficiency. The sheer scale and longevity of this bureaucratic system had a profound impact on the demographics and social structures of Eurasia, the effects of which are still being unraveled by geneticists and historians today. The constant, forced migration of millions of people, primarily women, across the continent created a genetic diaspora that is only now being fully understood. While the Y chromosome of Genghis Khan and his male descendants is the most famous genetic legacy, the mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mothers to their children, tells a much broader and more tragic story. Studies of populations from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific coast reveal distinct maternal lineages that originated hundreds or even thousands of miles away, providing a biological map of the Mongol slave routes. These genetic signatures are the silent, molecular testimony of the countless women who were uprooted from their homelands and forcibly integrated into new societies. This was not a minor demographic shift. It was a deliberate, empire-wide policy of human transplantation that altered the genetic landscape of the continent. The bureaucratic records that managed this vast human exchange were the tools of this grand, terrifying project of social and biological engineering, a project whose consequences are literally written into the DNA of modern populations across Asia and Eastern Europe. The strategic use of terror was the cornerstone of Mongol conquest, a weapon meticulously sharpened and deployed with psychological precision. The Mongols understood that a reputation for overwhelming and systematic brutality could paralyze enemies, break the will to resist, and secure surrender without costly sieges. This was not the impulsive violence of a berserker. It was a cold, calculated policy. The stories of their atrocities were deliberately allowed to spread, carried by a handful of survivors fleeing from a sacked city. These survivors became unwilling agents of the Mongol psychological warfare campaign, their traumatized accounts creating a wave of dread that crashed ahead of the advancing armies. A city would hear of its neighbors' fate, the men slaughtered, the women sorted and led away in chains, the children evaluated for their utility, and the defenders' morale would often shatter before the first Mongol scout was even sighted. This weaponized fear was incredibly effective. In many cases, cities would surrender outright, hoping for mercy that was never guaranteed. The unpredictability of Mongol response was itself a tool. Sometimes a surrendering city was spared and absorbed into the tax base. Other times, it was still sacked as an object lesson to others. This kept all conquered peoples in a state of perpetual, anxious submission, never sure if compliance was enough. The initial trauma inflicted upon captured women was a critical part of this terror campaign, designed to be a public and soul-shattering spectacle. Before a woman was ever touched by her new master, she was often forced to witness the absolute destruction of her old life. She might be made to watch as her husband, father, or brothers were executed, their bodies piled into grim pyramids of skulls. She might see her children, deemed too young or too weak for integration, killed before her eyes. The goal of this calculated cruelty was to sever every emotional and social tether she had, to demonstrate the utter powerlessness of her former world and the absolute authority of her new one. Only after this systematic demolition of her psyche was she claimed as property. The trauma was fresh, her resistance shattered, her spirit broken. She was now a blank slate, primed for the process of rebuilding into a compliant slave. This methodical breaking of the spirit was considered more valuable than simply breaking the body. A physically broken slave could still rebel or attempt escape. A psychologically broken slave had lost the very will to do so. The Mongols were masters of this dark art, understanding that true conquest was not just over land, but over the human mind. The empire's vast intelligence network, crucial for governing such a diverse realm, relied heavily on these broken women. Once a captive's identity had been erased, and she had been conditioned through a mix of terror and petty rewards, she could be repurposed as an unwilling collaborator. Her knowledge of her native language, customs, and social hierarchies made her an invaluable asset. These women were often used to interrogate new batches of prisoners or to identify individuals of value hiding among the common folk. They could spot the speech patterns of a nobleman trying to disguise himself as a peasant, recognize the delicate hands of a merchant's daughter, or point out a woman known for her skill in medicine or weaving. Their betrayals, forced under the threat of violence against themselves or others, were the oil that lubricated the Mongol administrative machine. They became the translators, the identifiers, the cultural interpreters who helped the conquerors quickly understand and control the societies they had shattered. This was the final, cruel twist of the system. It turned the victims into essential tools for the subjugation of their own people, ensuring the machine of conquest could run with terrifying efficiency. The intergenerational impact of this systematic trauma created a legacy of psychological damage that shaped societies long after the empire's fall. Children born of rape or raised by enslaved mothers inherited a world of profound confusion and fractured identity. For those of mixed parentage, the conflict was especially acute. They were taught to value their Mongol heritage, yet they were often stigmatized by it and never fully accepted. They grew up witnessing their mother's powerlessness, internalizing a model of the world where submission was the only path to survival. The trauma experienced by the first generation of captives was not a single event. It became a behavioral and emotional inheritance passed down. Mothers, themselves broken, taught their daughters the strategies of appeasement and invisibility, how to suppress any spark of defiance that might bring punishment. This created a self-perpetuating cycle of oppression that required less overt violence over time. The psychological profile of conquered populations was altered, fostering a deep-seated fatalism and a tendency towards centralized, autocratic leadership, a collective craving for strong authority that could protect them from the kind of chaos the Mongols had embodied. The empire's greatest and most tragic success was not just in the cities it razed, but in the enduring marks it left on the human psyche, scars that shaped cultures, political structures, and worldviews for centuries to come. The collapse of the unified Mongol Empire in the 14th century did not bring an end to the systems of slavery and human trafficking it had perfected. It simply decentralized them. The great khanates that emerged from the empires, fragmentation, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China each inherited and maintained their own sophisticated slave apparatus. The techniques of mass abduction, bureaucratic management, and psychological conditioning did not vanish. They were adopted and refined by these successor states, becoming deeply embedded in the political and economic fabric of Eurasia. The Golden Horde, for instance, continued to raid Eastern Europe for centuries, funneling a steady stream of Slavic slaves to the markets of the Crimea. These markets, in turn, supplied the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and the rising Ottoman Empire, creating a durable economic network built on human misery that outlasted the Mongol polity by hundreds of years. The Mongols had not just created a temporary empire, they had established a lasting infrastructure for human exploitation that would shape regional histories for generations. When compared to other historical slave-holding societies, the unique and terrifying comprehensiveness of the Mongol system becomes starkly apparent. The Vikings, often portrayed as fearsome slavers, operated on a much smaller, less organized scale. Their raids were conducted by individual chieftains for personal gain and prestige, with no overarching imperial strategy. The Romans built an economy deeply dependent on slave labor, but their approach was primarily economic. Slaves were acquired to work mines, farms, and households. The Mongol use of slavery was far more holistic and strategic. For them, slaves were not just a labor force. They were a multi-purpose resource. They were a reward system for the military, a tool for psychological warfare, a means of genetic empire building, and a key component in their administrative control. The Romans sought to exploit the bodies of the conquered. The Mongols sought to possess and reshape their very essence, systematically erasing the past to engineer a future loyal only to the empire. This strategic depth is what sets the Mongol slave apparatus apart, making it a grim precursor to the mass social engineering projects of modern totalitarian states. The most enduring and scientifically verifiable legacy of this system is written not in parchment, but in the very genes of modern populations. Geneticists studying the DNA of people across Eurasia have uncovered the undeniable biological footprint of the Mongol conquests. The most famous finding is the Y chromosome lineage linked to Genghis Khan and his male descendants, which spread with astonishing rapidity across the continent. But this tells only half the story of the conquerors. The other half, the story of the victims, is preserved in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed exclusively from mother to child. Population studies reveal distinct maternal lineages in Central Asia and Eastern Europe that can be traced to distant geographic origins. These genetic markers are the silent, molecular testimony of the millions of women who were forcibly taken from their homelands and whose wombs became the vehicles for the empire's demographic expansion. This genetic evidence provides a census of suffering that transcends written history, confirming the staggering scale of the Mongol slave trade and its systematic sexual exploitation. It is a biological archive of a crime against humanity that spans continents and centuries. Ultimately, the story of the Mongol Empire and its treatment of captured women forces a profound and unsettling reckoning with the nature of historical legacy. How do we judge an empire that was simultaneously a catalyst for unprecedented global connection and a perpetrator of industrial-scale human suffering. The Pax Mongolica, the period of stability that allowed goods and ideas to flow from Europe to China, was built upon a foundation of mass slavery and terror. The administrative innovations that governed this vast territory were designed to manage the extraction of resources, human and otherwise. To celebrate the Mongol role in connecting the world while ignoring the rivers of tears upon which that connection was built is to tell a dangerously incomplete story. The Mongols demonstrated that terrifying efficiency in conquest and administration could be achieved through the systematic dehumanization and processing of human beings. Their empire stands as a stark monument to a central, disturbing question of history. Can great historical shifts, even those that ultimately lead to connection and exchange, ever be justified when they are propelled by engines of profound and widespread cruelty? The evidence of the genetic record, the silent voices of the millions of enslaved women, and the chilling efficiency of their bureaucratic system suggest that the price of the Mongol Empire was a human cost of almost unimaginable proportions, a cost that we are still, 8 centuries later, struggling to fully comprehend and reconcile. The story of the Mongol Empire is, at its core, the story of a machine designed for conquest, but fueled by human lives. Its most critical and most tragic components were the millions of women who were systematically harvested, processed, and integrated into its terrifyingly efficient system. From the moment of capture, their old identities were marked for destruction. They were not simply prisoners of war. They were raw material to be refined through a relentless process of psychological and physical conditioning. Their value was calculated with cold precision, as laborers, as sexual servants, and most strategically, as vessels for a genetic empire-building project that sought to create a new ruling class loyal only to the Khan. The Mongols did not just want to defeat their enemies. They wanted to absorb them, to digest them, and to repurpose their very biological and cultural essence for the expansion and perpetuation of their power. The captured woman was the unwilling bridge between the conqueror and the conquered, her body and spirit the terrain upon which the final, most intimate battle for domination was waged. This system's success was rooted in its breathtaking scope and its bureaucratic sophistication. It was not the chaotic plunder of a barbarian horde, but a state-sponsored, continent-spanning enterprise in human trafficking. The Mongols developed a logistical network capable of moving millions of captives across thousands of miles, with way stations and processing centers that functioned with the dispassionate efficiency of an abattoir. They created a legal framework, the yasa, that codified the status of slaves, turning human beings into a category of property akin to livestock. Scribes maintained meticulous records, tracking the distribution and movement of human cargo with the same attention to detail they gave to sacks of grain or herds of horses. This bureaucratic coldness, this application of administrative genius to the business of human misery, is what separates the Mongol system from all that came before it. They proved that atrocity, when organized with sufficient skill and ruthlessness, could become the foundation for lasting power. The legacy of this system is not confined to the history books. It echoes in the modern world in profound and disturbing ways. The most visible legacy is genetic. The Y chromosome of Genghis Khan and his male descendants is carried by an estimated 1 in every 200 men alive today, a stunning biological testament to the scale of their breeding programs. But accompanying this is the quieter, yet equally vast, mitochondrial DNA of their mothers, the captured women whose lineages were forcibly woven into the fabric of populations from the Danube to the Yellow River. This genetic evidence provides an irrefutable, scientific census of the Mongol slave trade, a molecular memory of suffering that spans continents. Beyond biology, the psychological and political legacy is equally significant. The trauma of the Mongol invasions and the systematic cruelty they introduced fostered a deep-seated culture of centralized autocracy and suspicion in regions like Russia, shaping their political development for centuries. The techniques of mass control, dehumanization, and bureaucratic management of populations pioneered by the Mongols would be refined and repeated by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, from Stalin's gulags to the Nazi concentration camps. So, how are we to finally judge the Mongol Empire? Were they visionary unifiers who connected the world and spurred a new era of global exchange? Or were they the architects of history's most efficient human trafficking network, innovators in cruelty whose methods would inspire generations of tyrants? The evidence forces us to a difficult conclusion. They were both. The Pax Mongolica and the Terror were two sides of the same coin. The trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried shackled human beings. The administrative systems that governed a multicultural empire were designed to manage the exploitation of conquered peoples. To acknowledge one aspect while ignoring the other is to fundamentally misunderstand history. The Mongols achieved their stunning success by embracing a cold, pragmatic truth that more civilized societies often shy away from: that human beings can be processed like any other resource, and that terror, when applied with systematic precision, is a weapon of unparalleled power. They built their empire on mountains of bones and rivers of tears, and they regretted nothing. Thank you for joining us on this dark journey into one of history's most formidable and frightening empires. We hope this exploration has shed light on the uncomfortable truths that lie beneath the surface of the standard historical narrative. If you were captivated by this story and want to witness more of history's untold chapters, please subscribe to Timeline Uncovered. Drop a comment below telling us where you're listening from. We're always curious to know where these stories find a home. Your engagement helps us continue to explore the shadows that mainstream history often prefers to ignore, because understanding the depths of what we are capable of, at our very worst, is the first and most crucial step toward ensuring it never happens again.